Hi, my name is Unit Carrillo, Montessori teacher, trainer, and consultant, answering your questions about Montessori philosophy and practice. So today's question is, how do you approach having difficult conversations with parents? Part one. Part two, how do you give clear feedback without drowning on the negatives, but still being honest with parents? How do you give clear feedback while not drowning on the negatives, but still being honest with parents? I get it. Okay, here is my take on this. The first thing I'm going to ask about this question is, what do you mean by negatives? Because if we are fully in, so Montessori was a scientist, and her approach to observing children was to stay as objective as possible. And so when we're being objective, there isn't really a negative. There's cause and there's effect. And there are times when there's a behavior that has an impact on the environment that you don't want. I think it is a small but powerful shift in the frame. And I think that's a big one for me when I'm working with teachers is a constant practice of reframing, because your bias is going to seep out in your interactions with the parent and the child. They are so highly sensitive. Children in the spiritual embryo are just like little waving antenna, picking up information all the time with very little practice in zeroing in on something or having the experience on planet Earth to make sense of it. Highly energetic relationship that you have here with 0 to 3 children. So I guess I'm going to ask you to reframe that negative and think about what you mean by that. So I'm going to take some examples that are kind of classic examples when you're working with infants and toddlers that I've seen teachers get really kind of hung up on. Let's take an example like a child is very, let's say, physical with other children, and the undesired outcome of that is other children are getting hurt. So that's something that you don't want in your environment, but it's also just a behavior. If you can take the emotion off of behaviors, that's like this heavy weight that we put on children when we have all of this sort of bias. When we're talking to them, they can feel it, but they don't understand it. And a lot of times it has to do with our own bias and our own childhoods. And I mean, I think the thing that I do the most, I put the most emphasis on when I'm working with teachers in training is know yourself. Begin with you and figure out your stuff, because you're going to accidentally put it on children and families if you're not really clear about what you're bringing to the relationship. You want to be as sort of clear of a vessel as you can be when you're working with young children and families. And so first bit of feedback here is to reframe the negative and make sure that you're not putting that onto the child when you're interacting with them. I think a really big deal when we're working with young children is being aware of our own inner child and how it is coloring our experience of this brand new child that's in our environment. We have a lot of emotional hangups as adults around, let's say, food. That's a really big one for us. Who has a really healthy relationship with food? I think it's less common to have a really healthy relationship with food and eating. And that plays out when you're working with a child who is learning to eat, who's learning to read their body and recognize the cues of hunger and thirst, or I'm full, or I'm distracted, so I can't focus on the food. And so that's a really, really important one. So I'm going to kind of zoom out in this question and say, think about what you mean by negative. Okay, still being honest with parents. How do you give clear feedback? This is going to go back to some questions that I had earlier, and I'm always going to err on the side of heavily investing into relationships with parents and families early in the relationship. And so before the child even steps foot in my environment, I have sent surveys, I've made phone calls, I've made a home visit. We may have met in the classroom environment for the first time with the child when it was just us, maybe me and one other member of my team. So really be gentle and thoughtful and slow about bringing a family into the fold of your environment. And so really normalizing communication, it's really important to not hit a parent with something that's challenging as your first or second or third conversation with them. You haven't built the trust with them to be able to have a productive conversation. Yet, unless you've been doing that heavy investing. When parents see that you are consistent, that you are sensitive and responsive, they are going to trust your instincts. And so when you have something that you've seen in the environment and you're not putting your own negative bias on it, because the parents can sense that too. If you're being judgmental about their child's development, or I think one of the biggest offenders is if you are shaming their child or shaming the parent, judging the child, judging the parent. They're going to feel that, and they are going to understandably get defensive. And so a lot of my approach comes back to the self and what are you bringing into the conversation? Are you being objective? Are you being kind of aware of your judgment and trying to put a little bit of distance there? And are you having, normalizing conversations and communication with the family? And if you can even just do that simple reframing of the negative, like whatever that behavior is, just take a minute to sit with it. All right, what is the behavior? Am I accidentally amplifying this with my team? Am I setting an example of objective observation with my team? Or am I getting frustrated? Am I judging? Is my bias coming out? Because my team, if I'm the lead, they're going to be looking at me to see how to interact with this child. And if I'm doing that, they're going to do that. And then you're just going to have a really tough situation on your hands because that child is not going to feel safe and they're not going to trust you or your team. So the question was, how do you give clear feedback without drowning on the negatives, but still being honest with parents? And my answer is start with yourself, examine your bias, and ask your team for feedback. If you're struggling with a child, it may go deeper than just the behavior. Maybe expectations in your household were not aligned with what you see. Maybe the child has a behavior that you kind of admire, but you didn't have the courage to do that when you were little. Or you didn't have the freedom to do that. There's so much, I think, psychology here, and just be onto yourself. Be onto yourself about what you're bringing into the relationship with the child and the parent. Thanks for your questions. Keep them coming. I love to hear from you.